Thanks everybody for hanging out. Excited to talk to you. I'll try to make this brief and we can make it a little bit of a discussion. If at any point you can't hear me or anything, just kind of like wave your hands and I'll stop and figure it out or repeat something, but we're good. Okay, great. See, I want to talk to you about crypto AI stuff. It's a pretty interesting area. I've been working in it a little bit this year, and the title here, so do androids dream of centralized commitment devices? It's a reference to a paper that I'm going to sort of talk you through and try to give an extension of. It's going to be like lightly technical, but we're just going to kind of breeze through it. And I'm going to just sort of hope that, if anybody wants to explore the technical parts more, just say, hey, we can come back to it, or you can ask pressing questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to try to give you the flavor of it. So I'm Matt. I'm the head of research at Pantera Capital. I'm an economist by training. I'm sorry, I'm research partner now. As of a month ago. Yeah, I've been in crypto for a good bit. There's my Twitter there at the bottom. I said I would do that. Stephenson H Matt. So you can reach me there. You can DM me there, etc. I've been writing and doing research in crypto for quite a bit. Last year I wrote a paper with some colleagues at Ethereum Foundation and Flashbots about cooperative AI via decentralized commitment devices. Basically, this kind of like why AI, why blockchain paper that was warmly received. We got to present it at this big prestigious AI conference called NeurIPS that some of you probably know, which is cool. They usually don't let the crypto folks in, or at least, we were pleased by their friendliness. And then Vitalik was kind enough to link it in his post on what works and what doesn't in crypto AI. Unfortunately, he linked it in the most promising quadrant. So at the very least, it seems like a promising direction. And the idea is it's this kind of like agent-based future, which I think we're all hearing a lot more of these days. But way back in the days of November, this was relatively cutting edge, right? The idea that AI would go in the direction of semi-autonomous agents that would run kind of locally. And if you do that, it's going to be useful to have a blockchain. We're going to argue, and the reason we argue is a little on the technical side. Screenshot that bottom part. It hinges on a technical detail, but the technical detail is pretty straightforward. So I'll just say it, and that's that there's a very computationally efficient way to train an AI, a loss function, and it's external regret minimization. And if you train a bunch of agents that way, what happens is they start behaving in this way that assumes more cooperation than you necessarily are going to get. It's called CCE, stands for a coarse correlated equilibrium, if you want to impress people at dinner parties. And if you put people out with these sort of like assuming cooperation value functions, they can be exploited. It's a little bit like, how they say the animals in the Galapagos, they're very friendly, right? The seals will come right up to you because there are no predators. It's a little bit like we're training these AI agents, or we can train them to be these like nice Galapagos animals, but then if you release them into the jungle, they'll be predated upon, right? The predators can go after them and they won't have natural defenses. And that predation looks like MEV. So that's the sort of punchline. We're basically saying if you do this in a decentralized way, right, or like if you release these agents out in the computationally efficient way, it's going to look like MEV. And where are you going to see commitment and like robustness to MEV? Probably a blockchain context where we've been like testing that out and trying to become resistant to it and at least I don't know. We have experiments on MEV, to the tune of many, many millions, right? So we have some experience there. So this talk, I want to just sort of extend this perspective and sort of generalize the approach in the last one, so that it's not just about what I again said, external regret minimization. Do something way more general, right? You saw the Apple announcement, probably. We know OpenAI is talking a lot about agents. Microsoft's talking about doing agents, right? But the real thing we're dealing with now is like we're probably dealing with LLM sort of agents, right? Maybe diffusion model sort of agents. And so that's the context I want to talk about it today. And I want to give you this kind of like black box argument this argument for why, if we're using these models, still blockchain might be really interesting, and maybe just a little preview of what that might look like. So that's going to have two steps. First of all, I'm just going to kind of like tell you a little more about what I mean, set the stage. Secondly, I'm going to give you a kind of market argument, because I have to explain what I think is going to happen, or what are some possible scenarios for how well OpenAI does, or Microsoft does, or Apple does, right? Like whether these things run locally on your devices or whether you're always pinging OpenAI servers. And then I want to give you this sort of toy game that makes it reasonable to assume a blockchain will be relevant to these agents. So we'll start here with just sort of like setting the stage. And to set the stage, I gotta. Oh no, I'm sure nobody actually meant that thumbs down, but you know how Apple does. It gives you, it'll like give you the emoji on there. I just saw it. Give me a second to recover. All right. Cool. Uh, anyway, though, okay. So look, the thing is, I've got to talk about the future a little bit here because they haven't released this stuff, right? And so I have to engage in this like a little bit of VC futurism because look, like VC's right there on the slide. That's where I'm from. And as you know, what we do, the classic VC futurist thing is like, here's what I invested in, and then like here's the podcast I listened to, and like here's the sci-fi novel I read, right? And then you just sort of like mash those together, and wherever they sort of intersect, like that's the future, right? The future is the thing that I can talk about that seems interesting on podcasts that also is going to make me money. I'm going to try to avoid that today. I don't think that's actually going to be relevant to what I'm saying, but I'm aware of the tradition of futurism, and I'm going to try to do a better job for us here, if I can. But call me out if I don't. Okay, call me out if I don't. So like, where are we? Just to set the stage in AI, basically, we just had these two models kind of drop from the sky a year or two ago, really, right? Where like you have a diffusion model, you have a transformer model, an architecture, I guess, if you will, and there's nothing really special about them mathematically. Like I'm told this on pretty good from one of the authors of Transformers, the Transformers paper, actually, and some others, right? Like I've been on pretty good authority that you put this on a whiteboard and I show you the math of a transformer compared to other architectures. There's nothing about it where you're like, oh my God, this is going to work. What happened? It did. It just really worked, right? What does it mean that it really worked? Like, why are we kind of excited about LLMs and diffusion models? I think the particular way it worked is it showed really high returns to compute and really, really high returns to data, right? So it just happened that this was the architecture where if you just threw the best chip at it, right, and ran all the data you could possibly have, right, it gave you something kind of interesting. And then if you did more and more, it kept giving you more and more interesting stuff, right? And so you saw these stepwise improvements. And so in that sense, I guess I want to set the stage by saying these architectures kind of just fell from the sky and worked. That's where we're at. We don't understand them really, right? They're sort of black boxes to us. And so that's one important fact I think we have, which is like, we don't know whether there will be new architectures. There weren't for a really long time. These two seem to work. We don't know why. And they have these two features of returns to data and compute. So that's the sort of future variables we're going to explore. And then I guess I'm just going to also assume that like these things are obviously pretty useful. I don't know. Something is interesting going on when I chat with Claude 3 and it answers questions. Yes, it BS's, yes, it whatever. But like I find obviously that there is something going on in this that it would be useful to me, right? I find it useful on a daily basis. And I could imagine it trusting its responses to some tasks such that like if I asked it to do a thing and it was a really low value thing or it was a better model, maybe it would do that thing and I would trust it, right? Like if I could look at it after and give it a thumbs down if it did a bad job or something like that, but I might be able to sort of set it to work for me. So that I'm not going to defend, but just sort of assume it's true. All right, so let's do this like future thing real quick, okay? Two futures. I gotta, you've all sat through an AI talk at some point or listened to a podcast, right? And there is this like wild speculative side of it that, of course, is exciting. Where it's like, what does money even mean, man? And or the world's going to end, right? We don't have any idea what's going to happen in our wild, crazy, speculative, exciting AI future. I'm not going to go there. And whenever the argument I'm making goes there, I'm just going to show you that picture and sort of say, look, all bets are off. You know what I mean? Like, money doesn't matter, or money matters a lot. Money doesn't matter because we're in a utopia. Money doesn't matter because we're all dead. Like, I don't know. I'm not going to talk about that. That's a future where enough stuff is different that maybe we don't have to do it. But then I'm going to say, if we're not in that future, I want to make it pretty plausible to you that crypto might have this kind of like, I would say not just might, but probably will have this kind of picks and shovels quality to it. Or at least that's what the argument I'm going to try to make is. So we'll do this part real quick. New architectures, these new things drop from the sky. I have no idea, right? Transformers work, diffusion models work. You get a new one, I don't know what it does, right? That we're in AI utopia land, ignore it. Let's say returns to compute just continue unabated or even improve, right? Well, maybe we're still in AI utopia land, right? Maybe LLMs become some new entirely different thing, even though we're still using a transformer model, right? That can do all sorts of things we never imagined. Okay, fine, right? But let's assume returns to compute aren't insanely superlinear, right? That they start to curtail a little bit, sublinear, maybe they get flat, right? Whatever it is, right? Well, in that case, I think you get things that start to diffuse, which is to say that maybe there are some, you think about it like TVs or something, right? There are some people, some uses where you're buying every year, when you can get a more advanced display, maybe you're in video editing or something like that, you want the most high def display possible. But for your average consumer, for your average person, at a certain point that stopped, right? Maybe you'll consider investing in a new TV every couple of years or something, but you're like pretty happy with 4K or you're pretty happy with what you have. And that's a concept in econ called satisficing, right? And I think that's a broad concept, but essentially the way I'm using it here is that at a certain point, right? Like you're pretty happy with what you have, and even though somebody can show you that the world's improved, right? That the resolution of the next screen is a little bit better, it's better by 1%. You don't really care much, right? And so I want to say that if returns to compute start to curtail, then all we have now is the ability to run these things that make people perfectly happy, like maybe a Claude 3 or whatever it is, or maybe an agent locally. We run them on our laptops, we run them on our watches, we run them on whatever, right? So if that happens, technology starts to diffuse. And there's where I'm bracketing it to the crypto picks and shovels. Now I'm going to have to like defend that later, right? I'm just sort of like that picture is going to be the place we go after this little part. Returns to data, I'm going to say it's basically the same thing, right? Insanely high returns to data. I don't know. AI utopia. But if it starts to be curtailed a little bit, then yeah, sure. It might be that there's some oligopolies who have some extra sort of abilities in the marketplace because of their ability to source data, right? And their ability to run it into their own models. But generally speaking, there are still going to be these models we can run locally that are pretty useful to us. And so that's what I'm again calling consumer diffusion, right? Which is to say, chips are still getting better, and the models that now maybe are a little expensive to run just get cheaper because of performance. And so we start running them locally, or we can run them locally, or at the very least, you have a sort of competitive landscape. Here's the whole chart because it feels weird to just give you three parts of a chart and not show you the whole thing, but there it is. Okay, so that's just my argument for why you should expect these models to diffuse at some point, why they should be run semi-locally or locally, right? And if you start there, if you give me that, I think I can make the case for why blockchain, right? And now, when you hear this pitch and you've read it, I'm sure at this point there's a crypto AI drumbeat, and there's a good narrative, and it goes, crypto's the always on 24/7 international programmable money, like what are some old stuff on 4chan, man, like that, people made in the finance industry in like the 70s. You think AI is going to use that? Uh, and maybe that argument's good. Doesn't seem bad to me, by the way. It's just not the one I'm going to give you because it wouldn't feel super interesting to you because you've heard it before, right? That's a fine pitch. And then there's a more advanced one. My colleague Davide, who's at Pin AI, a very cool crypto AI project, he has one that gets a little more micro that I think is very cool. I'm going to take it from the demand side because of the way we're doing this, which is to say, I want to argue that there's something in the nature of what you would have an agent do for you, right? That is going in a diffused context that's going to lead you to a blockchain, that's going to lead you to a decentralized commitment device. And so anybody who's worked with me before or seen my work, this is kind of a quote to live by for me. This is a guy who taught me game theory, Ken Benmore. He says, the crucial step in solving a real life strategic problem nearly always consists in locating the toy game that lies at its heart. So for me, I'm always trying to find the toy game. What's the thing we're talking about? What's the strategic situation, right? And here, no surprise, I'm going to try to give you a toy game that explains the case I'm making. Okay, so you can do this with wine. You can do this with an NFT if we're going to hand wave the Oracle problem. It's all going to kind of work out the same unless you really want to talk to me about Oracle stuff, which honestly could be interesting. But we'll hand wave it for now. Okay, so imagine you have a single good, right? And you have two people who want that good. Right? And the good, they're incompatible. You get to the wine store, there's one bottle of, I don't know, wine left. I don't know, times are tough. One bottle of wine at the wine store. Or maybe it's I don't know, you're in Napa. Maybe it's a Alexander Valley Silver Oak or something, right? It's the last one. You both need that one only because you really got to impress people. And so you both get there, right? And how do you solve that IRL? Well, humans are weird, right? It happens that probably the first person to put their hand on the bottle and walk it to the register is the person who gets it. And then if the person behind them said, no, 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 I'll offer you more money, that would just seem kind of weird. Could happen in theory, right? But imagine somebody else beat you to the bottle and they're about to go, and then somebody behind you go, and you go, no, 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 I'll give you 150, and you start a bidding war, right? You might do it. Probably will you feel awkward about it, right? Now imagine the like wine shop owner. Would they say, okay? I mean, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe they'd feel a sort of sense of propriety about it. Maybe they'd be like, no, 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 no. This is what I do. This is my business. I have a posted price. You know what I mean? Anybody who grabs it. We're in this case, we're kind of doing a like first come, first serve, posted price sort of thing, right? And because we're just these weird, squishy, like behavioral creatures, um, these things around like I don't know, I might feel ashamed to raise a bid, or this guy might feel some sense of professional dignity, such that he didn't want to accept a secondary bid, or I might feel like, hey, this person just got it first, fair is fair, right? Those are all kind of like these behavioral things, right? That maybe live a little bit in our emotions or in the social norms or social dynamics. And what I want to argue, and I'll defend this a little more in a second, is just that like we want to get away from that style of thinking when we're thinking about agents, because very unlikely that these agents have the same squishy behavioral stuff. So what does this sort of like slightly conflictual thing look like in an agent context? You task an agent to go get you the bottle of wine, and the next agent goes to get you the bottle of wine, right? I think that looks like bidding or overbidding or something like that, right? Like they wouldn't hesitate to do it. And if the seller is something like an agent or something like an AR or something, whatever, right, or it just gets more normalized, then maybe they start to accept it, right? So this becomes a little bit different. And here's what it would look like, let's say, right? Um, imagine your agents are tasked with getting you as much of this wine as possible, right? Like, let's say in theory you could split the bottle with this other person, just to make the analysis a little easier. So this is a normal form game. I'll just walk through it real quick. The thing in bold is basically ways you can split it where you get the whole bottle of wine, right? So if you go to like the person on the left who demands L, like a low amount of the wine, and then the person choosing on the top who demands H, you can see that they meet up there where it says 30/70 in the upper right. And that just means that the person who demanded low gets 30% of the wine, the person who demanded high gets 70% of the wine. But you can see that 70 plus 30 is 100, right? So at the very least, since they want as much wine as they can get, they're at least maximizing the amount of wine, right? So the bold part is the part where they get as much wine, as is possible to get. You can see in the upper left quadrant, those are parts where they have compatible demands where you can satisfy both at once, but they don't get all the wine, right? They leave some on the table. And then the 0, 0, 0, 0 area is when they make incompatible demands. They're both like, I want the whole thing. No, I want the whole thing, right? And then they have to figure it out, or there has to be some sort of conflict thing. That's the toy game, I'm going to say, of this sort of thing. And now here's the part that, it feels like I should be pulling a rabbit out of a hat here. Um, but I want to say that, like I alluded to earlier, this gets solved via norms, via trust, via professional reputations, via the fact that when we, in real life, we just feel weird about overbidding. We shouldn't use these trust assumptions in an agent context, I'm going to say, right? And this is just some game theory errata that I'm going to skip. But if anybody's interested, just ask me a question after, and I can go back to this and say what I'm going to say. The rabbit out of a hat part is just that if you introduce commitment, then this game gets very simple. Anybody who gets to commit first can win, right? I can give you an example of how, though. So basically, if I were to send a message to the person or who's going to show up to the wine store and say, I have a contract that says if I don't get this wine, right, $200 of mine is going to be burned, right? If you can just show that to the person who values the wine at, let's say, $100, they'll know never to show up and try to outbid you for wine because you're willing to bid 200, right? And it's only worth 100 to them. So you've made in this sense a credible commitment, right, to change your payoffs such that if you don't get it, you're out way more than this thing is worth to the other person. So the other person shouldn't show up and try to bid. But because it's conditional, because you said, I only lose the 200 if I don't get the wine, that means the other person doesn't show up. You go and get it, right? And you don't lose the 200 because you get to prove to the contract again, we're hand waving Oracle problems here, so please bear with me, right? You get to prove to the contract that you did get the wine, thus your $200 doesn't get burned. So it's kind of free in that sense. That's the magic of commitment. Now there's a bunch of weird problems around it, which is to say, why do we pick one person to get commitment, not the other? What does it look like if they both have commitment at the same time? Is there a commitment race? How much do they, blah blah blah. There are all kinds of problems, but generally speaking, all I really need for this argument is commitment is useful. Like if nobody commits and one person, if nobody's committing and somebody decides to, they do well, right? Now, does that mean that everybody should commit? Maybe, right? That's not the story we need to tell. We just need to tell the story that this is a natural situation for agents to be in, and it's a situation where commitment is an optimal deviation for any individual agent. So that's kind of where I'm getting with this, and that's the sort of like in point of this toy model. As far as the argument goes, why blockchain gives you decentralized commitment in some context, right? Context where this kind of thing we're calling the Oracle problem is solved. I don't think that's especially a big deal, just because shouldn't make a commitment in cases where the Oracle problem isn't solved. Otherwise, you're not really making a commitment. But it is interesting to talk about, so we can come back to it. So here's the tell them what you told them slide. I realized I said I was going to be quick and skip some stuff. I think I only skipped one slide. So appreciate you all kind of bearing with me. But the essential argument was, right, I think it's reasonable to think that AI tech diffuses and decentralizes and gets run locally. I think it's reasonable to assume that these things are agentic, right? And that means if they're agentic, they're sort of independent and they're after in some cases, a similar resource, which means there's some sort of conflictual game going on, right? If you're in that situation, you're better off deviating to commitment. One of them is, at least, right? Because you can do strictly better. So commitment starts to emerge as a result of these interactions. And the best place to commit, I would say pretty much for sure, if the Oracle problems are solved, when they're solved, is a decentralized commitment device. And then what happens from there? Well, it really depends on your model. There's a lot of different things you could imagine as the next step of the slide I showed you before, which is not really an equilibrium slide. It's more just like a first step. But those don't really matter for the argument, actually. It only matters that you would like to have commitment. Where does that go? I don't know, right? Or maybe we could guess. So anyway, that is the sort of like rough draft of the what might be the next paper. And I appreciate you listening to it, and I'd be excited to answer any questions you have. Again, dropping my Twitter twice, feeling good here. But at any rate, thank you all for listening.
That was awesome. I have some interest in squishy AIs. Let's take like 3 questions, and we'll have you come up here and ask them both into the mic and specifically to Matt. So come on up. Great.
This was great. Thank you. How does this work in a repeat game? Because okay, you make a commitment for $200. And if we're competing against one another, well, now I'm going to bid 198, knowing you need to spend 199, so that you have less resources for the next game. Does that become a problem?
So I did keep saying, fortunately, I don't have to tell this story, but I do think it's an interesting story. The reason I think I don't have to tell it is to make the point why the blockchains get used. You only need to show that it's optimal to commit once, and I think you're asking a good question, an excellent question, which is what happens after that. Right? Because you're right. What happens isn't the other person just goes, gives up and goes home, right? So I gave you this slide that I said, hey, somebody come up and ask a question, and I'll go back to it. So you're asking about a repeated game, right? So I'm saying don't use repeated game assumptions here, and I'll tell you why I think that, right? Even though, by the way, I use them all the time, so I'm not really hating on repeated game assumptions, right? It's just that this is another fun dinner party thing. You probably know this question, or if anybody doesn't know this, if you want to impress people at dinner parties, there's this thing called the Folk theorem, right? And it basically shows that even if you have these kind of miserable game theory situations like a prisoner's dilemma, if you play them enough times, you can still find the very best thing. But the Folk theorem, which we're very excited about because it says we can get to the best thing, it actually doesn't say that we do get to the best thing. It actually says basically that anything can happen. And here's your dinner party language. It says that any outcome in the convex hull of feasible payoffs, which of the stage game, can be supported as a Nash equilibrium. So that does include the very, very best payoff, but it also includes the worst one, right? And so what we get in a repeated game scenario is just more confusion, especially when we don't have these behavioral inclinations to rely on, right? Because I think you and me, when we talk about repeated game and when I use them in mechanism design for humans, humans will often coordinate on the best thing. It's just a Schelling point, right? We kind of go like, well, look, this is the thing where we both get the most, right? But strictly speaking, anything happens in a repeated game, right? So I don't know that it's the best model in an agentic context. And I do think even then, commitment is always a good deviation, right? Like what winds up happening in terms of a repeated game, like you sound like you know some game theory. So like, could you imagine a case where maybe somebody enforces Grim Trigger if anybody commits or something like that, right? Where they get punished forever, maybe. Like it's possible, but even in that case, I think commitment still needs to exist, right? Like it still needs to be off equilibrium for that to be enforced. So I think I still live in the commitment matters. That's a sort of a long technical explanation to your question, but was that to the point?
No, it is. Thank you, and I appreciate that. And one thing that commitment in game theory always reminds me of is like the burning the ships strategy. If people are familiar with it, like the army general burns the ships to commit the army to moving forward. Now they can't retreat. So like, yeah.
Exactly. That's great.
Actually, the part I'm wondering about is I don't think you needed AI to make a lot of this story true. So are you seeing this with people in blockchains already? Do you think you're seeing people like abuse commitment in games? And what does AI like change or make more interesting about it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good question, right? Like, I think probably this question of why commitment, let's say, do we see it, right? And if not, why do we not? If it's so powerful, why do we not see it more often? You know, I'm gesturing toward that with my we're weird behavioral creatures, right? We have these sort of like social norms and so on. And I think the last questioner made a good point, right? Like there's also a repeated game phenomenon and an element of these things, right? I think why would it especially be the case in an AI context? I think the what I was trying to get to, and I think what is probably the strongest statement for why AI represents a state change is like if you have somebody who's just a sort of like pure rational agent trying to carry out this person's preference, right? That person is probably not going to have the behavioral picadillos, but also more to the point, it's not necessarily that hard to program something that can exploit any particular behavioral picadillos that you could program in, right? And so I think it would be harder to build in the sort of identity-based trust assumptions that you might have in a human context. So you do see it on chain, right? With like, but we try to get around it by like finding ways to to like fight against Sybil attacks and whatever. So we can sort of get this reputation and we can enforce it, right? But I think when you think about those models, a lot of times what you're trying to imagine is that like underneath these different accounts, you have like one stable identity and that identity wants a thing. But in an agent context, even if you figured out like Sybil, right? This agent can want a thing until time t+1 and then change what it wants. And it can do that programmatically to exploit whatever your like response function is. Again, these are great questions. So I'm sorry that these are like such technical responses. But to me, it basically lives in the fact that like you can program something that can exploit these situations that we take for granted and might override or obviate commitment. But great question. And hopefully that did it justice. If not, DM me. I'd be interested in talking about it further.
What would you say is the highest value use for something like this? I think you're right that it's pretty likely we end up in a AI agents world, and that can have a pretty optimistic version, and it can have a pretty detrimental version. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about either the like foreseeable benefits that we will experience, or maybe also what are some of the avoided detriments that if this infrastructure exists, then we might not have to worry about.
Okay, fantastic question. You're setting me up for such an alley-oop here. So thank you for that. We're talking about governance today, right? Like a lot of today's talks have been about governance. Is that right? Or do you right. Yeah. So let me talk just a little bit about governance, because I think this is probably true generally, but I think it's especially true in crypto. Like, what's one of the biggest benefits? Abstractly, I would say one of the biggest benefits of agents is just that, like, as humans, again, to use the behavioral thing, we have these attention costs, these switching costs. It's hard to show up to, let's say, I don't know how many of you have like telegrams where people are bothering you to sign a multisig or whatever for some DAO vote. But I don't know. I find it hard to endlessly channel attention to all these things, even though I should, right? And so these things that have like small fixed cost of attention, even though the decision problem isn't that hard, like if you just looked at it, maybe you could make the decision, like a lot of DAO governance. I think agents can help that. So one of the things I'm pretty excited about is there's been this increasing research around trying to not just make agents that can sort of like do what you tell them, but agents that can be like little low resolution versions of you in particular contexts, right? Like the idea that you could there's work being done on these kind of like survey designs where you could imagine you take a 20-page profile question about, I don't know, your interest in DeFi and I don't know, whatever, your age and your income or like whatever variables are going to be in the principal component analysis relevant for doing this. And now we have a little agent that could vote on your behalf at about, let's say, 70 to 80% of the fidelity of your ability to vote. If you do that, then a lot of governance problems change, right? You could actually imagine cases where you are able to do participation in governance in a lot of ways in a fairly valid way. So that feels like one big unlock to me would be under participation, which of course plagues governance in general, but of course plagues DAOs and multi-sigs and things like that. And if you solve that problem in an interesting way, right, like where the attention cost or the switching cost goes down, that's a huge unlock and a very interesting one. And then just taking that analogy and saying more generally, I think any case where there's things where we wish we could do things, but the switching cost or attention cost or whatever, right, like administrative sort of stuff is too high, those just feel like pretty straightforward unlocks for agents, right, if they're able to carry out our interests. So also great question, all great questions.
Amazing. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.